which was about the question on December 28th that we spent, I think, about all of our time in, was, were the Restoration preachers saved? And that's a question I've received through the years. And just by way of reminder, the Restoration preachers were men who were in denominational bodies in the late 1700s, early 1800s, who, completely unknown to one another, decided that they would that they would make an effort to go back to the Bible and set aside whatever creeds or books that were out there. The various Baptist groups had what was called the Westminster Confession of Faith, which I think dates to in the 1640s. There's the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, which came along later. There were all types of books of discipline. The Methodists had their various books of discipline. The Presbyterians had their Institutes of the Christian Religion, which were the books written by Calvin. And all these men, again, unknown to one another, said, look, we're tired of this we're tired of the writings of men bringing about religious division. And they all just sought to go back to the Bible. And the remarkable thing, it's remarkable to the world, but it's not remarkable to us. But these men all began to draw same basic conclusions. For example, about what a person has to do in order to be saved. That many of them were practicing sprinkling water on infants and calling it baptism, and others, practicing various ideas about baptism. And when they put all of their books aside and just opened their Bibles, they all began to come to the same conclusions. Alexander Campbell was one of these men. For the life of me, Barton W. Stone was another. Campbell was working in the Pennsylvania area. Barton Stone was working in the Kentucky area. And by the time these two men met, there were literally thousands and thousands of converts as a result of the work of each of these two men, completely independent of one another. And so that sets a framework for us to know that what those men did 200 years ago can be done today. If people are willing to set aside the creed books, the catechisms, the books of discipline, the confessions of faith, we can all arrive reasonably to the same basic conclusions on the fundamentals of the faith. The question was, were these men saved? And ultimately what I said was, that's not my business to make that determination. Whatever God decides will be right. But you might remember my little graph here that I drew about talking about if you're starting at ground zero, what direction are you going and how far are you on the scale, out to 100. But now we've got people in the church that are going in the wrong direction. They're leaving the truth. And I told you about my friend Jerry. I'm a friend. I never knew anything. I don't think that's his last name, but that's how his email came up. How Jerry was a member of some Church of God in Indiana. They had abandoned the instrument. They were teaching baptism for the remission of sins. So where is this guy? Where is this guy on the scale? Well, I don't know where he's at on the scale, but I know what direction he's going. And then we've got our own brethren, denying the essentiality of baptism for the remission of sins. And I can cite you specific examples, churches that I know, where people are doing this. Where are they on the scale? Well, I don't know, but I know they're going in the wrong direction. And I made the statement, I'd rather be here going in the right direction as to be here going in the wrong direction. I think, if I was going to throw myself on the mercy of God, I'd want to be going in the right direction as opposed to the wrong. But that's just me. Now that's just my personal belief. And so, what God will determine to do with those men is up to Him, and the judge of all the earth will do right. We know that whatever God determines will be exactly right. And so, but then this question, the follow-up question was that we didn't get to was about, and I mentioned it and I never did get back to it, was about, did Alexander Campbell start the Church of Christ? Because that's what most people in the religious world believe. They believe that Alexander Campbell started the Church of Christ. I did mention on the 28th that Campbell's father beat him to the United States by about a decade, Thomas Campbell. And he was already a group that was abandoning the works of men. In fact, they were Presbyterians. And their group was called the Springfield Presbytery. And there was a document written called the Declaration and Address. And what it was that they had determined, we're going to go back to the Bible and we're going to let the Bible be the source of our authority in everything that we do. And they put those things, they wrote those things down. And you can buy a copy of the Declaration and Address. You can see what they wrote. But the Declaration and Address came out in about 1803. And it was, again, part of Thomas Campbell's group. Alexander Campbell didn't get to the United States till 1809. October of 1809. And when he came to the United States, he was still a Scottish Presbyterian. Campbells came from Scotland. And so Alexander Campbell was introduced to the idea of the Bible and the Bible alone by his own father. Yeah, and he embraced that principle and then carried it further. Obviously he was much younger than his father, and then he carried on that tradition. But there were others doing the exact same thing. Like I said, Barton Stone, Raccoon John Smith, other men were doing the exact same thing, abandoning the works of men and only following the Bible. And so we know just from that Alexander Campbell didn't start the Church of Christ. In fact, Campbell was going to be, I believe, in a debate in New Orleans. I can't remember if it was the debate with the atheist or if it was the debate with the Catholic priest. I'm leaning toward the Catholic priest, and I have that debate in my office. But the largest newspaper in New Orleans credited Campbell with starting the church, and he wrote them a letter, and he said, "You've given me way too much credit." He said, I haven't started anything. I've just simply gone back and taken what God has already given us in the Scriptures and gone from there. But he said, I haven't started anything. So even Campbell himself, during his own lifetime, was accused of starting the Church of Christ and adamantly denied it and publicly denied it in a letter to the editor. I said it was New Orleans. It might have been the Picayune Times. For some reason, that paper name is coming into my mind. But in any event, Campbell didn't come to the United States until October of 1809. And when he came, he was a Scottish Presbyterian. He left the Presbyterian Church for the Baptist Church, only on the account that Baptists practiced immersion rather than sprinkling babies. And he didn't leave the Baptist Church until he was kicked out of it in 1832. He was a member of the Redstone Baptist Society and got kicked out of the Baptist Society for teaching the division between the New Testament and the Old Testament. He preached a sermon on the two covenants, and that sermon was the basis of his ouster from the Baptist Church. In other words, he taught what we have always believed, the division of the covenants. And so now we're talking about the 1830s, and Campbell's just now finally being released from association with denominationalism. Well, in my office at the house, I have a manila folder. It's about that thick. And it contains photocopies of the records of the Rocky Springs Church of Christ. What's the little old town before you get to South Pittsburgh? Bridgeport. If you're going on 72 out of Huntsville, headed toward Interstate 24 like you're going to Chattanooga. Before you get to South Pittsburgh, where the Lodge factory is, you'll go to Bridgeport, or you'll go by Bridgeport. And when you're on 72, and you're going east, you'll see a sign that says the Rocky Springs Church of Christ. And it says, oldest Church of Christ in Alabama, 1807. And I have copies of the physical records, the handwritten records of that church dating back to about 1809. So let's do a little math. You know, the math ain't mathin' if you think Alexander Campbell started the Church of Christ. Because the Rocky Springs Church of Christ has physical records that go back to about 1807 or 1805, somewhere in there. And Alexander Campbell didn't get to the United States until 1809. And when he got here, he was a Scottish Presbyterian. Now, you see how it's impossible to defend the idea that Alexander Campbell started the Church of Christ? Because that church already existed. Listen. The church at White House was established in 1845. I think it's the oldest church in the county. But you think, what are the odds that Campbell didn't get out of the Baptist church until 1832, but we have a Church of Christ right here in Marion County that was established in 1845. You see, this was a movement that started all over the United States. What was then the United States. Alabama and Mississippi and Missouri, they were the western frontier at that time. Alabama had just found statehood. And so, we have records of churches of Christ that in Alabama that predate Alexander Campbell's arrival to the United States. So just logically speaking, we know that Alexander Campbell did not start the churches of Christ. And that talks to us about what we talked about earlier, about the difference in Restoration versus Reformation.
Well, is there a long history of the church, like in England or
there
Scotland, before, like when people started coming over to
there is a book written by Keith Sisman, and Brother Sisman died just a few years ago. Sisman published a book, and I have it. It's called Traces of the Kingdom. And he's from the United Kingdom. Okay, he's from the UK. And he did a historical study into the churches of Christ in that part of the world, going all the way back, I know, to the 1400s and perhaps even the 1300s.
Because, we're just not that old of a country for there to be a long history of the church in this country.
Yeah, there couldn't be a long history of the church in this country because we're fixing to celebrate 250 years, and then only 100 years or 150 years prior to that, was anybody over here practicing in some form of Christianity. But Keith Sisman's book, Traces of the Kingdom, is a historical record of the churches of Christ in the United Kingdom, hundreds of years prior to the Restoration movement in the United States. And that book's available. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it anywhere. He has pictures of buildings, that have inscriptions on them, such and such Church of Christ. And which, by the way, there were a lot of groups that referred to themselves as the Church of Christ well before the American Restoration movement, because they understood that the church belongs to Christ. In fact, if you read the writings of the Roman Catholic Church, and if you read their catechism, which I have, you'll find many references to the Church of Christ. But they're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. They're not talking about the church that we know as the Church of Christ. They refer to themselves as the Church of Christ. And so there were groups that were using that moniker or that label, not so much as a formal name, but as a descriptive name that go way way back. I'll give you one more example of this. One of my heroes of the faith was William Woodson. Woodson taught Bible at Freed-Hardeman for years, taught Greek, directed the Freed-Hardeman lectureship for years, and Woodson was a really good friend of mine. He would come down and teach the Bible class at Winfield on Thursday, once a month on Thursday nights. And he and I spent a lot of time together. And Woodson told me that there are documents in the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library is the home of the Catholic Church. But there are documents in the Vatican Library that date to the 12th century, which is the 1100s, where they record persecuting people for practicing believers' baptism for remission of sins. Now, in other words, not practicing infant baptism and sprinkling infant baptism, but practicing believers' baptism for the remission of sins. There's documented cases of the Catholic Church persecuting people for practicing that. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that the Bible was in the hands of people all the way back then. And the people that were reading the Bibles that they had also understood that baptism was immersion of people who believed the gospel, and it was for the purpose of receiving the remission of sins. And so now, what are we talking about? We're talking about almost 1,000 years ago. People are still believing and practicing what we believe. And then you hear me talk about the Ante-Nicene Fathers a lot. And those guys didn't get everything right, not by a long shot. But they all believed that baptism was immersion for the remission of sins. I mean, for hundreds of years after the establishment of the church, that was the orthodoxy. Baptism is immersion in water in order to receive the remission of sins. And in fact, baptism in many cases was called the very grace of God. They referred to baptism as the water of grace. Notice that's where grace was appropriated in the life of the sinner. And so there are, and I'm glad Rhonda asked that because I would have forgot to mention it. But there are records of people practicing what we practice that go back 1,000 years. The reason we can't find an unbroken record is that whoever's in charge writes the history books. I mean, what would history books look like if Hitler had won World War II? And he was controlling who wrote the history books? What would history books look like if the Confederacy had won the Civil War? What would our history books look like? The Roman Catholic Church ruled most of the world for hundreds of years. Well, who do you think wrote the church history books? Who do you think wrote just the regular history books? And they did, and they controlled the world through kings. Through the British Empire and the German Empire and the Spanish Empire and the Roman Empire. They directed the heads of state all over the world. Whoever's in charge writes the history book. And so that's why we don't see an unbroken history of the church in the writings of men. But having said that, I will say this. It's not necessary for there to be an unbroken history of the church. I personally believe that there is an unbroken history of the church because the Bible has always been in the hands of the people, and I believe the Bible can be understood, enough to know the basics, but it's not necessary. We could quit playing baseball for 1,000 years, right? And all we got to do is dig up one rule book. And we can play the game just like it was played 1,000 years ago, right? If baseball didn't get played for 1,000 years and nobody even knew about baseball, it'd been so long. And we found one rule book of baseball, we could restore baseball and it would be played what? Exactly the same way the game would have been played 1,000 years before. And so I don't think an unbroken history is necessary because the seed is the Word of God. In your study of history that they found seeds in the pyramids, that were thousands of years old, and then they planted them. And you know what happened? They came up And you know what came up? The same thing that would have come up if those plants had been planted 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Luke 8:11, the seed is the word of God. So I don't think there has to be an unbroken history. I personally believe there is an unbroken history, even though there's no record of it. Not a consistent record. But I don't think it's necessary. All right. So then the next question that came to me after somebody saw the December 28th session was, what do you think was worse for the church? The apostasy or the Reformation? I never thought about that. All right, so here's what is meant. Here's what is meant by that. Paul prophesied about an apostasy, right? A departure from the faith. That's what the word is in 1 Timothy 4:1. In the latter times, some shall depart from the faith. That's the word apostatize. Giving heed to seducing spirits and the doctrine of demons. So the question is, if this is, for example, this is the straight line of truth. Okay? This is truth. Truth doesn't veer to the right or to the left. But shortly after, and even during the times of the writing of the New Testament, the apostles warned that apostasy was taking place. And so what you find is in the earliest days of the church, there began to be small departures from the faith. But what happens to this line the farther it gets? What happens to this line in relationship to this line? It gets further away, thank you. So through the course of time, you have this. And this is the apostasy. Roman Catholicism. Then you get to, and we'll just say for the sake of argument, you get to the year 1517, and you end up with the 95 Theses written by Martin Luther, nailed to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, which started what is known as the Protestant Reformation. Now we just refer to it as the Reformation. It's originally known as the Protestant Reformation because it was a protest against the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic priest. And he wrote down 95 things that he thought that the Catholic Church was getting wrong. And he nailed those things to the door of the church. And it got him excommunicated. So then he and his followers became known as Protestants. And eventually became known as Lutherans. But during this time, from 1517 to about, let's just say the year 1600, there began to be a number of departures. And you have the Lutherans, and you have the Presbyterians, and in the middle of the early 1600s, you have the Baptists, and then later you end up with the Anglicans, which is the Church of England, which that church was started because Henry VIII couldn't get a divorce. The Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce, so he just started him a new church. And he broke away from the Catholic Church and started the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. And he appointed the Bishop of Canterbury as the head of the Anglican Church, and that's how it still stands today. That church was started because a man couldn't get a divorce from his wife. Well, from the Anglican Church, you ended up with the Methodist Church. And from the Methodist Church, you ended up with various forms of charismatic and I'm just gonna say Holy Spirit type charismatics, the spiritual gifts. Those arose out of the Methodist movement. And so now the question is, what was worse for the church itself? The apostasy or the Reformation? And by the way, there is no right or wrong answer to this question, okay? It just gives us something to think about.
Well, the Reformation, that just causes confusion.
That's what I was thinking. That was my very first thought, was that the Reformation is worse because of the mass confusion. The spread of this mass confusion has led to the religious landscape that we have today. Thousands of different denominations, of all different types. And I'll just add this: the rise of the American spirit also, in some ways, contributed to this. We as Americans, we think about the idea of rugged individualism, right? Rugged individualism. In other words, a man can make it on his own. He doesn't want any help from the government. He wants to get up and pull himself up by his own bootstraps and make his own way. What are you going to say, Bobby? It used to be that. That's right.
Yeah,
but a person can still do that, right? There's still that. America is one of the few nations, if not the only nation left on this earth, that has people who think that way. But there's a sense in which that idea bled over into religious practice, in that if I don't like the way things are, I'll just go start my own. I mean, isn't that essentially what every storefront church is? Every strip mall, essentially every strip mall church is. I don't like the way things are being done where I am. I'm just going to go start and do it the way I think it ought to be done. You see, that's rugged individual. There's a great place there's a great place for rugged individualism, but the church is not one of them. It's great that it's a great spirit for America. It's a terrible spirit for the church. And so there's a sense in which our Americanism has, that American psyche also has contributed to this problem. I'm like Rhonda. I think this was worse. I think this was worse because it's a whole lot easier. Let's just put it this way. Let's say that we're all traveling together, right? All of us, we love each other so much we're going on vacation together. All right? Some of y'all laughing. Zach is not laughing. Zach is out. He ain't going with nobody. Right? So we're all going on vacation together, right? And we're in a convoy of cars, right? We're like travel balls, Zach. We're in a convoy of cars. Right? And here we go. And we're all following. Since Zach didn't want to go, we're going to put him at the head of the convoy. We're all following Zach. All right? Here we head all. And here's Zach. We're following Zach. What? It's possible. So now we've all followed Zach off course, right? At what point? No, I got to take this thing one step further. We get to this point right here, and Bobby said, "Man, Zach don't know where he's going." So here goes B for Bobby. There goes B for Bobby. All right. I'm trying to look for people with names on here. Philip. There's Philip. There's Philip. Philip's going to go. Philip's going that way. There's Cookie. She's farther off than anybody.
Lynn's up there.
There's Lynn. Lynn's right here. Here's Ann. Ann. Where's my M? where's my Mark? She ain't here, but we're going to put her out there. All right. And there goes Martha. All right. At what point is it easier to get everybody back on track? At what point?
Before everybody started their role.
No, before we got to right there, right? If we're all following Zach, and all of a sudden at this point, Zach says, hey man, we are on the wrong road, but we're all still following Zach. And Zach makes a hard left and gets us back to there. Then we all get back there, don't we? We all get back there. But if we wait till we get to this, big roundabout, and somebody dives off at the first exit on the roundabout, and somebody at the second exit, and somebody at the third exit, and somebody at the fourth exit on this roundabout, and everybody drives for about another hour, then how easy is it to get everybody back? It's not impossible, right? And by the way, I've been thinking about this if y'all hadn't figured this out. That's why I think what Rhonda said is right. And not just because I got to go home with her tonight. I think what she said is right because it's easier to get everybody back on track if everybody's in the same place. You know, but when you get to here, you're herding cats, right? When you get past the roundabout, you're herding cats. And by the way, and while you're trying to round up some of these, what's happening over here? It's getting not only further away, but all of a sudden you ended up with all these groups. You know, you end up then you got 3 Methodist groups, and you've got 3 different Presbyterian groups. And you've got, man, how many Baptist groups do you have? You see, the longer this thing goes, the more this thing, just gets completely out of hand. Now, the solution for every one of them is exactly the same, isn't it? What's the solution for apostasy? And do what? And go back to the Bible. Isn't that right? The solution for apostasy is repent and go back to the Bible. What's the solution for every bit of this? The exact same, right? But because now there's been so much diversity of thought, and people have become so entrenched in the way of thinking that says, we're all going to heaven. We're all just taking different roads. And guess what? None of them's on the right road. None of them's on the right road. I mean, this is a very simple illustration, right? Because I'm not a complicated person. And we can all see this. And so, in answer to the question, I think the Reformation was more damaging to the church than the apostasy because of how widespread and how insidious it had become in the minds of people. Because all you have to do is open up the paper every Saturday or Wednesday or whatever day your paper comes out, and there's a whole page in that local paper that says what? Attend the church of your choice. It's in the newspaper every week. Now, used to, eventually, if you went to St. Louis and you read the St. Louis paper, it'd say attend the church or synagogue of your choice. And now you know what some of them say? Attend the church, the synagogue, thank you, Wade Ramsey, or mosque of your choice. You see how that thinking has poisoned the mind, religiously has poisoned the mind of the American people.
Well, and that, and we're much more culturally diversified now.
Oh yeah, now you've got so many people have come from all over the world and brought everything.
example, when I went to high school in a suburb of St. Louis, we were all the same color. We were all pretty much the same economic status, but I saw somebody posted on one of my high school websites that now there are 20 different languages as a first language being spoken at my old high school.
20 different languages at your old high school.
As their first language.
That's in South County, St. Louis, y'all.
That's like not in the city, that's like in a small suburb. And so now the school where I attended, where everybody looked just like me, and their parents looked just like my parents, now they don't look like me anymore. And when you come from other countries, you're going to also bring other things besides what we've done here in the United States. You're going to bring what they're doing over there also.
Right.
Which just muddies the water that much more.
Right. So, again, I don't think there's a wrong answer to it, but in my illustration, and I probably drew the illustration to make the point the way I wanted to make it. This is more damaging. This is more damaging to religious unity than this. Again, just to me, just on a practical basis. All right. Any questions or other thoughts on that at all? Because I really don't have enough time. I actually brought two more questions, and I don't have time to even deal with one of them. And so, I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Let me turn this off. I thought we had a really good class for our men tonight.